when a mute cowboy hires a desperate Mexican woman to care for his dying mother in the harsh Wyoming territory of 1867. Neither expects the quiet stranger to become the voice his heart has been searching for. But will love be enough to overcome the prejudice and self-doubt that threatens to tear them apart forever? The gunshot cracked across the frozen Wyoming morning like thunder, sending a flock of crows bursting from the bare cottonwood trees. Jacob Hartwell lowered his rifle and watched the wounded coyote limp away into the sagebrush, knowing he should have aimed better, but somehow glad he hadn't killed it. Death seemed to follow him everywhere these days, and he was tired of being its helper. The November wind of 1867 bit through his worn leather coat as he walked back toward the small log cabin that sat like a lonely island in the endless sea of prairie grass. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin gray line against the pale sky that told him his mother was still alive, still fighting the sickness that had been eating away at her lungs for months. Jacob's boots crunched through the frost-covered grass as he approached the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by the knowledge of what waited inside. His mother, Catherine Hartwell, lay propped up in the bed he had built for her with his own hands, her breathing shallow and raspy, her once bright eyes now dulled by pain and the medicines Dr. Brennan brought from town. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, and the warmth hit his face like a gentle slap. Mrs. Henderson looked up from where she sat beside his mother's bed, her weathered hands folded in her lap, worry etched in every line of her face. "She's been asking for you," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice carrying the weight of bad news. "Been calling your name for the past hour." Jacob set his rifle against the wall and pulled off his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. He had learned long ago that words were dangerous things, capable of hurting people you loved without meaning to. Better to stay quiet, to keep the sharp edges of his thoughts locked away where they couldn't cut anyone. He walked to his mother's bedside and knelt down, taking her thin hand in his calloused one. Catherine's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled when she saw him. The same smile that had comforted him through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreak. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than the wind outside. "I had the strangest dream. I was young again, dancing with your father at the harvest festival. Do you remember how he used to make me laugh?" Jacob nodded, squeezing her hand gently. He remembered everything about his father, the way he could make anyone smile with just a few words, the way he had filled every room with warmth and laughter. Jacob had inherited his father's strong hands and steady heart, but the gift of easy conversation had died with the man who gave it. "Mrs. Henderson has been so kind," Catherine continued, her breathing labored. "But I know she has her own family to tend to. I worry about being a burden." "You're not a burden, Mama," Jacob said, the words scraping past his throat like sandpaper. They were some of the first words he had spoken in days, and even these few felt like lifting stones. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat, and Jacob looked up to see her shifting uncomfortably in her chair. "Jacob, I need to talk to you about something. Outside, if you don't mind." Jacob felt his stomach drop. He kissed his mother's forehead and followed Mrs. Henderson out onto the small porch, where the wind immediately began working its way through his shirt. "I can't keep coming every day, Mrs. Henderson said without preamble, her voice heavy with guilt. "My youngest boy has taken sick, and with winter coming on, I need to be home to help with the harvest. I'm sorry, Jacob, I truly am." Jacob nodded, understanding flooding through him even as panic began to build in his chest. He had known this day would come, had seen it in the way Mrs. Henderson's visits had grown shorter, the way she kept glancing toward her own home across the valley. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, the question torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I can't leave her alone, but I can't stay here all day either. The cattle need tending, and without the money from selling them, there might be someone—" "Mrs. Henderson said quickly, as if she had been thinking about this for days. "That new girl at the boarding house in town, Elena Martinez. She's been looking for work, and Mrs. Keating says she has a gentle way with sick folks. She helped nurse old Mr. Peterson through the fever last month." Jacob frowned. He had heard about the Mexican girl who had arrived in Cheyenne a few weeks ago, traveling alone and asking for work. In a town where most people looked at strangers with suspicion, a young woman with dark skin and an accent had not been welcomed with open arms. "She's different," Mrs. Henderson continued carefully. I know some folks in town have opinions about that, but she's clean and honest, and she needs the work. Might be perfect for both of you. Jacob looked out across the prairie, where the morning sun was beginning to burn off the frost. The idea of bringing a stranger into their home, of trusting his mother's care to someone he had never met, made his chest tight with worry. But what choice did he have? Can you bring her out here? He asked. So I can meet her? Mrs. Henderson's face brightened with relief. I'll go to town this afternoon and ask her. If she's willing, I'll bring her by tomorrow morning. That evening, Jacob sat beside his mother's bed, watching her sleep. The cabin felt too quiet, filled with the weight of all the things he couldn't say. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and whispered through the gaps in the logs, sounding like voices from another world. Catherine stirred, opening her eyes and looking directly at him. You're worried about something, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Mrs. Henderson can't keep coming, Jacob admitted. I'm going to have to find someone else to help take care of you. A stranger? Catherine asked, and Jacob heard both fear and curiosity in her voice. A woman from town. Mexican, Mrs. Henderson says. She's been helping other sick folks. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her breathing the only sound in the room. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers surprisingly warm. Sometimes God sends us help in ways we don't expect, she said softly. Your father used to say that angels don't always have white wings and golden hair. Sometimes they come looking like ordinary people, carrying kindness instead of harps. Jacob squeezed her hand, wishing he had inherited even a fraction of his parents' faith. All he had was worry and the growing certainty that he was about to fail the person who mattered most to him. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, the sound lonely and wild. Jacob thought about the wounded animal he had let escape that morning, wondered if kindness was always the right choice, or if sometimes you had to be cruel to prevent greater suffering. His mother's breathing grew steady and deep, and Jacob knew she had fallen asleep again. He sat in the darkness, listening to the wind and trying to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Somewhere in town, a stranger named Elena Martinez was probably lying in her small room at the boarding house, unaware that her life was about to become tangled with his, in ways neither of them could predict. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jacob closed his eyes and tried to picture what this Elena might look like, what her voice might sound like, whether she would be kind to his mother or simply see her as another job to be endured. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. But for now, he sat in the quiet cabin, holding his mother's hand and listening to the wind tell its stories to the empty prairie. The sun was barely an orange smudge on the horizon when Jacob heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. He had been awake for hours, pacing the small room like a caged animal, checking and rechecking his mother's breathing, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Now, as the hoofbeats grew louder, his heart began to pound against his ribs. Through the window, he watched Mrs. Henderson dismount from her old mare, then turned to help down a smaller figure from the second horse. The woman who stepped onto the frost-covered ground moved with careful grace, her dark skirts brushing against her boots as she looked up at the cabin. Even from a distance, Jacob could see that she was young, probably not much older than 20, with black hair braided simply, and clothes that were clean but clearly mended more than once. Jacob opened the door before Mrs. Henderson could knock, and found himself face to face with Elena Martinez. She was shorter than he had expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but there was something about the way she held herself that made her seem taller. Her dark eyes met his directly, without the fear or pity he had grown accustomed to seeing in people's faces. Mr. Hartwell, she said, her voice carrying the faintest accent that made his name sound like music. Mrs. Henderson tells me your mother needs care. I would be honored to help. Jacob studied her face, searching for signs of judgment or false sympathy, but found only honest concern. She didn't flinch when he didn't immediately respond, didn't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter the way most people did. Instead, she waited patiently, her hands folded in front of her, as if she understood that some people needed time to find their words. She's very sick, Jacob said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Might not get better. I understand, Elena replied. I've cared for sick people before. Sometimes helping them be comfortable is more important than making them well. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, breaking the tension. Why don't we go inside so Elena can meet Catherine? She's been awake since dawn, asking about when you'd be back. The cabin felt smaller with 3 people in it, and Jacob found himself hyper-aware of every sound. The scrape of boots on the wooden floor, the rustle of Elena's skirts, the wheeze of his mother's breathing from the bed in the corner. Catherine had propped herself up on her pillows, and Jacob could see she had tried to smooth her gray hair and straighten her nightgown. "Mama," Jacob said, his voice gentler than it had been outside. "This is Elena Martinez. She's come to see about helping take care of you." Elena approached the bed slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm Elena. Mrs. Henderson tells me you've been feeling poorly." Catherine's eyes brightened at the sound of Elena's voice. "You're very young to be taking care of sick old women," she said, but there was warmth in her tone, not criticism. "My grandmother always said that caring for people isn't about age. It's about heart," Elena replied, settling into the chair beside the bed. "May I ask how you've been feeling today?" As Catherine began to describe her symptoms, the pain in her chest, the way her breathing felt like drowning on dry land, Jacob watched Elena's face carefully. She listened with complete attention, occasionally asking gentle questions, never interrupting or rushing. When Catherine mentioned that she hadn't been able to keep food down for days, Elena's brow furrowed with concern. "Have you been drinking enough water?" Elena asked. "Sometimes when we're sick, we forget to drink, and that makes everything worse." "Water tastes like metal," Catherine admitted. "Everything tastes wrong." Elena nodded knowingly. "I know some ways to help with that. Tea made from certain herbs can settle the stomach and make water taste better. And there are foods that are easier to keep down when you're not feeling well." Jacob felt something loosen in his chest as he watched the 2 women talk. Elena's questions were gentle but thorough, and she seemed to understand things about his mother's illness that he hadn't even noticed. More importantly, Catherine was responding to her in a way she hadn't responded to anyone in weeks, with interest, and something that looked almost like hope. "I'd like to try working with you," Elena said after they had talked for nearly an hour. "If you're willing to have me, I could come every morning and stay until evening, help with meals and medicines, and just keep you company." Catherine reached out and took Elena's hand, her thin fingers wrapping around the younger woman's wrist. "I think I'd like that very much. It gets lonely here with just Jacob, and he's got so much work to do." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks at his mother's words, but Elena didn't seem to judge him for not being able to do everything himself. Instead, she squeezed Catherine's hand gently. "Taking care of someone who's sick is hard work," she said. "Nobody should have to do it alone." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Well, if that's settled, I should probably head back to town. Elena, do you want to come with me today to get your things, or would you prefer to start tomorrow?" Elena looked at Catherine, then at Jacob. "If it's all right with you, I'd like to start now. I could go back to town tonight and bring my things tomorrow morning." Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. He wasn't sure if what he was feeling was relief or terror, but he knew there was no other choice. His mother needed help, and Elena seemed genuinely willing to provide it. After Mrs. Henderson left, the cabin felt different, smaller, but somehow warmer. Elena moved around the space with easy confidence, examining the medicines Dr. Brennan had left, checking the water bucket, looking through the few cooking supplies Jacob had managed to keep stocked. "Do you have any fresh vegetables?" she asked, not looking at him directly. "Or herbs growing nearby?" Jacob shook his head. "I'm not much of a gardener. There's a general store in town, but I don't get there often." "That's all right," Elena said, still moving around the cabin. "I noticed some wild plants growing near the creek on the way here. If you don't mind, I could gather some tomorrow. They might help with your mother's appetite." Jacob watched her work, fascinated by the way she seemed to see possibilities where he saw only problems. She had only been in the cabin for 2 hours, but already she was planning improvements, thinking of ways to make his mother more comfortable. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, the question torn from somewhere deep inside him. Elena paused in her examination of the medicine bottles and looked at him directly. "What do you mean? You don't know us. You could probably find easier work in town. Why come out here to take care of a dying woman?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. "Because everyone deserves to be cared for when they're sick," she said finally. And because I know what it's like to be alone and afraid. Something in her voice made Jacob want to ask more questions. But before he could find the words, Catherine called out from the bed. Elena dear, could you help me sit up? I'd like to try drinking some water. Elena hurried to the bedside, gently supporting Catherine as she helped her into a more upright position. Jacob watched as she held the cup to his mother's lips, patient and steady, as Catherine took tiny sips. There, Elena said softly. That's better. Small sips are easier. Catherine smiled, and Jacob realized it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. You have gentle hands, she said. Reminds me of my own mother. Tell me about her, Elena said, settling back into the chair beside the bed. As Catherine began to talk about her childhood, her voice growing stronger with each word, Jacob found himself really listening to his mother's voice for the first time in months. Elena had somehow unlocked something in her, a willingness to remember good times instead of dwelling on present pain. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and orange. Jacob realized that for the first time in weeks, he hadn't spent the entire day worrying about his mother. Elena's presence had created a kind of peace in the cabin, a sense that everything might actually be all right. But as he watched Elena laugh at something his mother had said, Jacob felt a different kind of worry beginning to build in his chest. Elena was beautiful and kind and clearly too good for a life of isolation on the Wyoming prairie. How long would it be before she realized she had made a mistake? How long before she packed up her few belongings and disappeared back to whatever life she had left behind? The thought of losing her, of returning to the silence and fear that had filled the cabin before she arrived, made Jacob's throat tight with panic. He had only known her for a few hours, but already he couldn't imagine facing his mother's illness without her steady presence, her gentle voice, her ability to find hope in the smallest things. As darkness fell over the prairie, Jacob lit the oil lamp and began to prepare for Elena's departure. Tomorrow she would return with her belongings, and their real life together would begin. He just hoped he would be strong enough to deserve the gift she was offering, and wise enough not to drive her away with his own fears and inadequacies. Elena's scream pierced the pre-dawn darkness as she burst through the cabin door, her nightgown torn and muddy, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. Jacob bolted upright from his makeshift bed on the floor, his heart hammering as he saw her stumble and fall to her knees just inside the doorway. What happened? He demanded, rushing to her side as Catherine stirred weakly in her bed. Men, Elena gasped, her chest heaving as she fought for breath. 3 of them. They were waiting outside the boarding house when I went to get my things. They said Mexican women didn't belong in Cheyenne. Jacob felt rage explode in his chest like a gunshot. He helped Elena to a chair, his hands shaking as he examined the cut on her forehead. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely, and he could see bruises forming on her arms where rough hands had grabbed her. Did they follow you here? He asked, already moving toward his rifle. I don't think so, Elena whispered, accepting the damp cloth he pressed to her wound. I ran through the woods, stayed off the main trail. But Jacob, they took my bag. Everything I own was in there. Catherine's voice came from the bed, thin but angry. Who were they, child? Did you recognize any of them? Elena shook her head, then winced at the movement. Strangers. Railroad workers, maybe. They smelled like whiskey and tobacco. Jacob paced the small cabin like a caged wolf, his mind racing. The railroad had brought all kinds of men to Cheyenne, some decent, others looking for trouble. He had seen how some of them looked at anyone who wasn't white, heard their ugly words in the saloon on the few occasions he had gone to town. You're staying here, he said firmly. They won't bother you on my property. Jacob, I can't impose on you like that, Elena protested, but her voice was shaky with exhaustion and fear. It's not imposing, Catherine said before Jacob could respond. It's practical. You'll be safer here, and I'll have someone to talk to during the long nights. As the sun rose, painting the cabin in warm golden light, Jacob helped Elena settle into the small alcove where he usually slept. She had protested, but he insisted she needed rest after her ordeal. He would sleep on the floor. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the following days, Elena's presence in the cabin changed everything in ways Jacob hadn't expected. She moved quietly around the space, but her movements were purposeful and graceful. She had a way of humming softly while she worked that made even the most mundane tasks seem pleasant. When she helped his mother drink her medicine, she would tell stories about her childhood in New Mexico, her voice painting pictures of desert sunsets and mountain streams. My grandmother used to say that healing starts in the heart, Elena told Catherine one afternoon as she braided the older woman's hair. She said that when people feel loved and valued, their bodies remember how to fight. Jacob watched from the doorway, fascinated by the transformation in his mother. Catherine's cheeks had more color than they'd had in weeks, and she was eating small amounts of the soup Elena made from wild herbs and vegetables from the neighbors' gardens. But it was the way Elena looked at him that made Jacob's chest tight with unfamiliar feelings. She didn't seem to expect him to fill the silence with chatter. Instead, she would catch his eye across the room and smile, as if sharing a private joke. When he did speak, she listened with complete attention, never interrupting or trying to finish his thoughts. "You're good with her," Elena said one evening as they sat on the porch after Catherine had fallen asleep. "She talks about you constantly when you're outside working." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm not good with words like she is. Never have been." "Words aren't everything," Elena replied, her voice gentle. "The way you built that special bed for her, the way you check on her breathing at night when you think no one is watching, those things say more than any speech." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Jacob found himself stealing glances at Elena's profile, the way the lamplight from inside the cabin caught the shine in her dark hair. "Elena," he said suddenly, "why did you really come to Cheyenne? You could have stayed in New Mexico, found work there." Elena was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was engaged to be married, to a man my father chose. A good man," everyone said, "wealthy and respected." Jacob felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to listen. "The night before the wedding, I realized I couldn't go through with it, not because he was cruel, but because he saw me as property, something to be managed and controlled. I wanted to be valued for who I was, not just for what I could do for him." She turned to look at Jacob directly. "So I ran. I took what little money I had saved and rode north, looking for a place where I could make my own choices." "And you found Cheyenne?" Jacob said. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I found a town full of men who see me as either a threat or a conquest. Until I came here, I was beginning to think I had made a terrible mistake." "And now?" Jacob asked, his heart pounding. "Now I think maybe I found exactly what I was looking for," Elena said softly. "A place where I can be useful, where I can care for people who need me, where I can be myself." Jacob wanted to tell her that she was more than useful, that she had brought light into a house that had been dark for too long. But the words stuck in his throat, too big and important to risk saying incorrectly. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Elena's skin was warm and soft, and she didn't pull away. "I'm glad you came," he said simply, and saw her smile in the darkness. Inside the cabin, Catherine coughed softly in her sleep, and both Jacob and Elena turned toward the sound. They had created something together in this small space, not just a place for his mother to heal, but a pocket of peace in a world that often seemed determined to tear people apart. As they stood to go inside, Elena squeezed Jacob's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance when no one else would." Jacob wanted to say that she was the one doing them a favor, that she was saving his mother's life and possibly his own. But the words were too large, too complicated for his limited vocabulary. Instead, he squeezed her hand back and followed her into the warm cabin, where his mother slept peacefully for the first time in months, and where tomorrow would bring new challenges and new reasons to be grateful for the quiet strength of the woman who had chosen to stay. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jacob was outside chopping wood when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He looked up to see 3 men riding toward the cabin, their faces hard and unfriendly. His stomach dropped as he recognized one of them, Tom Bradley, a railroad foreman who had a reputation for causing trouble. "That's her," Bradley said, pointing toward the cabin where Elena had just appeared in the doorway. "That's the Mexican girl who's been stirring up problems in town." Jacob set down his axe and moved to stand between the men and the cabin. "What do you want?" "We want her gone," Bradley said, his voice cold. She's been filling the other Mexican workers with ideas about better wages and treatment. That kind of talk is bad for business. Elena works for me, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear growing in his chest. She doesn't work for the railroad. She works for you now, Bradley said with a nasty smile. But word is she's been talking to our workers on her trips to town, telling them they deserve better treatment, that they should stand up for themselves. Jacob glanced back at Elena, who was standing in the doorway with his mother visible behind her. Catherine looked frightened but determined, and Jacob knew she would defend Elena just as fiercely as he would. Elena has a right to talk to whoever she wants, Jacob said, his hand moving closer to the gun at his belt. Not when it interferes with railroad business, Bradley replied. We're giving you one warning, Hartwell. Get rid of her, or we'll make sure you both regret it. The men rode away, leaving Jacob standing in the yard with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He had known that Elena's presence would attract attention, but he hadn't realized how much danger she might be in simply for being herself. That evening, as they sat around the small table eating dinner, Jacob told Elena about the confrontation. Her face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I've been talking to the Mexican workers, she admitted. They're being treated badly, paid less than the white workers for the same job. I just told them they had the right to ask for fair treatment. That's not your fight, Jacob said, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Elena couldn't help but fight for what was right, even when it put her in danger. It is my fight, Elena said firmly. Those men have families, children. They deserve to be treated with dignity. Catherine reached across the table and took Elena's hand. You have a good heart, child. But sometimes having a good heart can get you into trouble with people who don't want things to change. I know, Elena said softly. But I can't pretend I don't see injustice just because speaking up makes some people uncomfortable. Jacob felt a surge of admiration for Elena's courage, mixed with terror at the thought of what might happen to her if she continued to speak out. He had seen what men like Bradley were capable of, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to hurt Elena if they thought she was causing problems. Maybe you should stay away from town for a while, he suggested, just until things calm down. Elena nodded, but Jacob could see the frustration in her eyes. She wasn't someone who backed down from fights, especially when she believed she was fighting for something important. As they prepared for bed, Jacob found himself watching Elena more carefully than usual. She moved around the cabin with her usual grace, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept drifting toward the windows. Are you scared? He asked quietly. Elena paused in her task of banking the fire. Yes, she said honestly, but not for myself. I'm scared for the workers who don't have anyone to speak up for them. I'm scared for your mother, who needs care that I might not be able to provide if something happens to me. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jacob said, his voice fierce with determination. I won't let it. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship. It was something deeper, something that promised a future he had never dared to imagine. I believe you, she said softly, and that's why I'm not going to run. Not this time. The blizzard hit Cheyenne like a living thing, howling and clawing at the windows of the small cabin with winds that seemed determined to tear it apart. Jacob woke to the sound of something heavy slamming against the outer wall, and when he peered through the frost-covered glass, he could see nothing but a wall of white that erased the world beyond their doorstep. How long has it been snowing? Elena asked, appearing at his shoulder with a shawl wrapped around her nightgown. Started around midnight, Jacob replied, his breath visible in the cold air. This is bad, real bad. Elena moved to check on Catherine, who was awake but seemed more alert than she had been in days. How are you feeling this morning? Elena asked, pressing her hand to Catherine's forehead. Better, actually, Catherine said, surprising them both. Maybe it's the storm, but I feel like I can breathe easier. Jacob felt a surge of hope, but he pushed it down. He had learned not to trust good days. They had a way of turning bad without warning. Instead, he focused on the practical problems the storm was creating. We need to check on the animals, he said, pulling on his heavy coat. If the wind keeps up like this, it could bring down the shelter I built for them. Jacob, you can't go out in this, Elena protested, moving to stand between him and the door. You'll get lost before you make it 20 feet. The cattle will die if I don't check on them, Jacob said firmly. And if they die, we won't have any money to live on come spring. Elena's dark eyes flashed with frustration. And if you die, what good will the money do anyone? The argument was interrupted by a sound that made all three of them freeze, the sharp crack of splintering wood from somewhere outside. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, trying to see through the swirling snow. There, Elena said, pointing to a dark shape moving near the barn. Is that one of your cows? Jacob squinted through the storm and saw what she was pointing at. 3 of his cattle had broken free from their shelter and were wandering in the open, their dark shapes barely visible against the white backdrop. If they weren't rounded up soon, they would wander off and freeze to death. I have to go, Jacob said, checking his rifle and making sure his knife was secure in his belt. Then I'm coming with you, Elena said, already reaching for her coat. Absolutely not, Jacob said, his voice harder than he intended. You stay here with Mama. Jacob Hartwell, you listen to me, Elena said, her voice taking on a tone he had never heard before. Those animals are how we survive. All of us. If you go out there alone and something happens to you, your mother and I will both be dead by spring. Jacob started to argue, but Elena cut him off. I grew up on a ranch. I know how to handle cattle, and I know how to survive in bad weather. You need help, and I'm the only help you have. Catherine's voice came from the bed, weak but determined. Take her with you, Jacob. Elena's right. You can't do this alone. Jacob looked from his mother to Elena, seeing the same stubborn determination in both their faces. He knew Elena was right, but the thought of putting her in danger made his stomach twist with fear. All right, he said finally, but you stay close to me. No matter what happens, you don't leave my side. Elena nodded and began pulling on her warmest clothes. Jacob watched her move with efficient purpose, tying a scarf around her face and securing her coat against the wind. She looked small and fragile, but he was beginning to understand that Elena's strength wasn't always visible on the surface. They stepped out into the storm together, and Jacob immediately understood why Elena had insisted on coming. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet, and the snow was falling so thickly that he could barely see his own hands. Without someone to help guide the cattle, he would have been trying to do an impossible job alone. There, Elena shouted over the wind, pointing toward a dark shape near the creek. One of them is heading for the water. Jacob nodded and began moving in that direction, with Elena close behind him. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and each step was a struggle, but Elena kept pace with him, her hand occasionally touching his back to let him know she was still there. The first cow was easy to catch. It was standing beside the frozen creek, confused and frightened. Jacob grabbed its halter while Elena positioned herself to guide it back toward the barn. But as they began to move, the animal balked, pulling against Jacob's grip with surprising strength. It's scared, Elena called out, moving to the cow's other side. Let me try something. She began talking to the animal in Spanish, her voice calm and soothing despite the howling wind. Jacob couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the gentleness in her tone. Amazingly, the cow began to calm down, allowing them to guide it towards safety. How did you do that? Jacob asked as they secured the first animal in the barn. Animals understand tone more than words, Elena explained, brushing snow from her hair. My father taught me that. He said that if you speak with kindness, most creatures will trust you. They found the second cow near the vegetable garden, trying to dig through the snow to find grass. This one was more cooperative, following them back to the barn without much resistance. But the third cow was nowhere to be found. Maybe it went back to the shelter on its own, Elena suggested. But Jacob shook his head. That one's always been stubborn. It probably wandered off toward the river. They spent another hour searching through the storm, calling for the missing animal, and following tracks that kept getting covered by fresh snow. Jacob was beginning to worry that they would have to give up when Elena grabbed his arm. Listen, she said. Through the wind, Jacob could hear a faint lowing sound coming from somewhere to their left. They followed the sound and found the cow stuck in a snowdrift, its legs buried so deep it couldn't move. We'll have to dig it out, Jacob said, but Elena was already kneeling beside the animal. Poor thing, she murmured, running her hands along the cow's neck. You're scared, aren't you? Don't worry. We'll get you out of here. Together, they dug through the snow with their hands, working as fast as they could while the storm raged around them. Jacob's fingers were numb with cold, but Elena never stopped talking to the trapped animal, her voice steady and reassuring. Finally, they freed the cow's legs, and it struggled to its feet with a grateful moo. But as they began to lead it back to the barn, Jacob realized they had a new problem. He wasn't sure which direction they had come from. "Do you know the way back?" he asked Elena, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Elena looked around, studying the white landscape. "I think so," she said, but Jacob could hear the uncertainty in her voice. They began walking what they hoped was the right direction, but after several minutes, Jacob realized they were lost. The storm had erased all familiar landmarks, and every direction looked the same. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice tight with worry. "If we keep wandering around out here, we'll freeze to death." Elena nodded, her face pale with cold and exhaustion. "There," she said, pointing to a dark shape in the distance. "Is that a building?" Jacob squinted through the snow and saw what looked like the old root cellar he had built years ago. It wasn't much, but it would protect them from the wind until the storm passed. They made their way toward the shelter, fighting against the wind with every step. The cow followed reluctantly, probably sensing that they were heading toward safety. By the time they reached the root cellar, all three of them were exhausted and half frozen. The cellar was small and dark, but it was warm compared to the storm outside. Jacob used his knife to cut some rope from his belt, tying the cow securely so it couldn't wander off again. Then he sat down beside Elena, both of them shivering as they tried to warm up. "Are you all right?" he asked, studying her face in the dim light. Elena nodded, but Jacob could see she was shaking with cold. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close to share his body heat. She leaned into him gratefully, and Jacob felt something warm spread through his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. "Thank you," Elena said softly, "for bringing me with you, for trusting me to help." "Thank you for insisting on coming," Jacob replied. "I couldn't have done this alone." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Jacob was aware of Elena's warmth against his side, the way her hair smelled like the herbs she used in her cooking, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Jacob," Elena said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you stop talking? I mean, really stop talking to people?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "My father died when I was 22, he said finally. "Right before he died, we had a fight about the ranch, about whether I was working hard enough. The last words I said to him were angry ones." Elena's hand found his in the darkness. "I'm sorry." After that, I kept thinking about all the times I had said the wrong thing, all the ways I had disappointed him. It seemed safer to just stop. Words can hurt people, and I didn't want to hurt anyone else. "But silence can hurt people too," Elena said gently. "Your mother misses hearing your voice. She told me that sometimes she feels like she's losing you bit by bit." Jacob felt a stab of guilt. "I don't know how to be the man she needs me to be. I don't know how to be the son my father wanted." "Maybe you don't have to be," Elena said. "Maybe you just have to be yourself." Jacob turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the root cellar, he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. It wasn't pity or judgment. It was understanding, acceptance, and something that looked like love. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you." Elena's breath caught, and for a moment, Jacob thought he had said too much, revealed too much. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said softly. Jacob leaned down and kissed her, and Elena kissed him back, with a warmth that chased away the cold and the fear and the loneliness he had carried for so long. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small root cellar, something beautiful was beginning to grow. Jacob held Elena close, and realized that sometimes the most important journeys happened not across great distances, but within the quiet spaces of the heart. When the storm finally passed, they made their way back to the cabin with the rescued cow, both of them changed by what they had shared in that small, dark space. Catherine took one look at their faces and smiled, understanding without words that something precious had been born in the heart of the blizzard. The elegant stranger in the expensive coat stood on their porch like a dark omen, his polished boots gleaming in the morning sun as he knocked firmly on the cabin door. Jacob's blood turned to ice when he saw the man's face, sharp features, cold eyes, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "I'm looking for Elena Martinez," the stranger announced when Jacob opened the door. "I am Ricardo Vasquez, and I have traveled a very long way to find her." Elena appeared behind Jacob, her face going pale as she recognized the voice. "Ricardo," she whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorframe. "My dear Elena," Ricardo said, his voice smooth as silk but with an edge that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Did you really think you could run from me forever? Your father is worried sick, and I have been searching for you since your unfortunate departure." Jacob stepped protectively in front of Elena, his jaw clenched. "She doesn't want to see you." Ricardo's eyes flicked over Jacob dismissively, taking in his worn clothes and calloused hands. "And you are?" "Jacob Hartwell. This is my property, and Elena is under my protection." A cruel smile played at Ricardo's lips. "Protection? From what? A life of comfort and respectability? I'm offering Elena everything a woman could want. A beautiful home, fine clothes, a place in society. What can you offer her? This?" He gestured toward the modest cabin with obvious disdain. Elena found her voice, stepping beside Jacob. "I don't want those things, Ricardo. I told you that before." "You were confused," Ricardo said, his tone becoming patronizing. "Young women often get foolish ideas about independence. But I'm prepared to forgive your little adventure. We can still be married. Still have the life your father planned for you." "No," Elena said firmly, though Jacob could see the fear in her eyes. "I won't marry you. I won't go back to New Mexico." Ricardo's facade of patience began to crack. "You will come with me, Elena. Your father has given me permission to bring you home by whatever means necessary. You belong to our family, and I won't let you throw away your future for some cowboy." Jacob felt rage building in his chest. "Elena belongs to herself. She's made her choice." "Has she?" Ricardo reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a marriage contract, signed by Elena's father. In the eyes of the law, she is already promised to me. If she refuses to come willingly, I can have her brought back by force." Elena's face went white. "That's not legal here. This is Wyoming territory, not New Mexico. Legal matters can be complicated," Ricardo said with a cold smile, "especially for someone with no money for lawyers. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to make this easy for everyone." He turned to Jacob, his eyes calculating. "I'll pay you for your trouble. $500 for the inconvenience of losing your housekeeper." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "Get off my property." "I think you misunderstand the situation," Ricardo said, his voice turning dangerous. "I didn't come alone." As if summoned by his words, two rough-looking men appeared from behind the cabin, their hands resting on their gun belts. Jacob recognized the type, hired thugs who would do anything for money. "Now," Ricardo continued, "Elena can come with me peacefully, or we can make this difficult for everyone. The choice is yours." Elena stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I choose Jacob. I choose this life. I choose freedom." Ricardo's face darkened with anger. "You foolish girl. You're throwing away everything for nothing. Do you think this man will marry you? Do you think he can give you children, security, a real future?" "Yes," Jacob said firmly, surprising everyone, including himself. "I do." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ricardo's eyes narrowed, and Jacob could see him calculating his next move. "Well," Ricardo said finally, "this is unexpected. Are you proposing to my fiancé, Mr. Hartwell?" Jacob looked at Elena, seeing hope and fear warring in her eyes. He had planned to wait to court her properly, but circumstances had forced his hand. "Yes," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger. "Elena, will you marry me?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, Jacob. Yes, I will." Ricardo's face twisted with rage. "This is ridiculous. Elena, you can't possibly be serious. What kind of life can this man give you? Look at this place. It's barely better than a shack. You'll be poor, isolated, forgotten. I'll be free," Elena said simply. "I'll be loved for who I am, not for what I can provide. That's worth more than all your money." "Love?" Ricardo laughed bitterly. "Love doesn't put food on the table or clothes on your back. Love doesn't give you a place in society or children who won't be ashamed of their parents." Jacob felt something snap inside him. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out now, before I do something we'll both regret." Ricardo studied Jacob's face and apparently decided he was serious. "Very well, but this isn't over, Elena. Your father will hear about this, and he won't be pleased. Don't expect to ever see your family again." Elena flinched as if she'd been slapped, but she didn't back down. "If they can't accept my choice, then they were never really my family." Ricardo turned to leave, then paused. "You have 24 hours to change your mind. After that, I return to New Mexico, and you'll be dead to everyone who ever cared about you." The three men rode away, leaving Jacob and Elena standing on the porch, both shaking with adrenaline and emotion. Elena collapsed into Jacob's arms, and he held her tightly, feeling her tears soak through his shirt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I've brought this trouble to you and your mother." "No," Jacob said firmly, stroking her hair. "You've brought joy to us. That man, he's the trouble, not you." Catherine's voice came from inside the cabin, weak but determined. "Bring her in here, Jacob. We need to talk." Jacob led Elena inside, where Catherine was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in weeks. She held out her arms, and Elena went to her, accepting the comfort of the older woman's embrace. "Child," Catherine said softly, "do you really want to marry my son? Not because you're scared, but because you love him." Elena nodded, wiping her eyes. "I love him more than I thought possible, but I don't want to trap him into marriage because of my problems." "You're not trapping me," Jacob said, kneeling beside the bed. "I've been wanting to ask you for weeks. I wasn't sure I had the right." Catherine smiled, reaching out to take both their hands. "Then we have a wedding to plan." And quickly, from the sound of it, over the next few hours, they made hasty preparations. Mrs. Henderson was summoned to witness the ceremony, and Dr. Brennan agreed to perform the service. It wasn't the wedding Elena had dreamed of as a girl, but as she looked at Jacob's face, she knew it was exactly what she wanted. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Elena wore her best dress, the one she had been saving for special occasions, and Jacob had borrowed a clean shirt from Dr. Brennan. Catherine, propped up in bed with pillows, served as the unofficial coordinator, making sure everything was perfect. "Do you, Jacob Hartwell, take Elena Martinez to be your wife?" Dr. Brennan asked. "I do," Jacob said, his voice strong and clear. "I promise to love you, protect you, and value your voice for as long as I live." "Do you, Elena Martinez, take Jacob Hartwell to be your husband?" "I do," Elena said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I promise to love you, support you, and help you find your voice when you need it most." They exchanged simple gold bands that Jacob had bought in town weeks ago, hoping for this moment. When Dr. Brennan pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Elena with all the love and hope he had been holding back. But even as they celebrated, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Ricardo's threat was far from empty. Men like him didn't give up easily, and Jacob knew they would need to be careful in the days to come. As the sun set on their wedding day, Jacob and Elena sat on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder. They were married now, bound together by love and law. But Jacob knew their real challenges were just beginning. "Are you sorry?" he asked quietly. "About your family, I mean." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sad," she said finally. "But I'm not sorry. Some prices are too high to pay, even for family. And besides," she added, squeezing his hand, "I have a new family now." Jacob kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "We'll face whatever comes together." "Together," Elena agreed, and Jacob felt some of his fear ease. Whatever Ricardo planned, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as husband and wife, united in love and purpose. Inside the cabin, Catherine smiled as she listened to their quiet conversation. Her son had found his voice and his heart, and she had gained a daughter she already loved. Whatever time she had left, she would spend it knowing that Jacob would not be alone when she was gone. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and the prairie wind whispered through the grass with promises of tomorrow. Jacob and Elena sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Dr. William Morrison arrived at dawn like a storm cloud, his black medical bag bouncing against his hip as he dismounted from his expensive horse. His sharp eyes surveyed the Hartwell cabin with obvious disapproval, taking in the simple construction and modest surroundings before settling on Jacob, who had emerged to meet him. "Mr. Hartwell, Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've received word that your mother is being treated by an untrained Mexican woman. This is highly irregular and potentially dangerous." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "Elena is my wife now, and she's done more for my mother than any doctor ever has." Dr. Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "Your wife? Good heavens, man. What were you thinking? This woman has no medical training, no understanding of proper procedures. She could be doing your mother irreparable harm." "She's helping her get better," Jacob said firmly, but he could hear the doubt creeping into his own voice. What if Dr. Morrison was right? What if Elena's remedies were actually making his mother worse? "Let me examine the patient," Dr. Morrison said, pushing past Jacob toward the cabin. "We'll see what damage has been done." Inside, Elena was helping Catherine drink a cup of herbal tea, her movements gentle and patient. She looked up as Dr. Herbal Tea and On Today shine. Morrison entered, and Jacob saw her face go carefully blank, the expression of someone preparing for attack. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Morrison said, setting his bag on the table with authority. "I'm Dr. Morrison. I've come to assess your condition and provide proper medical care." Catherine looked from the doctor to Elena, confusion and worry evident in her eyes. "But Elena has been taking wonderful care of me. I feel better than I have in months." "I'm sure you believe that," Dr. Morrison said condescendingly, "but feelings can be deceiving. Now, let me examine you properly." What followed was the most uncomfortable hour of Jacob's life. Dr. Morrison questioned everything Elena had done, from the herbs she brewed to the way she had arranged Catherine's bedding. He poked and prodded Catherine with cold efficiency, making notes in a leather journal and shaking his head disapprovingly. "The patient shows signs of improvement," he admitted grudgingly. "But that's likely due to the natural progression of the disease rather than any treatment. These folk remedies," he said, gesturing dismissively at Elena's carefully prepared medicines, "are at best useless, at worst dangerous." Elena's voice was steady, but Jacob could see the hurt in her eyes. "Could you tell me what specifically concerns you about the treatments? I'd like to understand." Dr. Morrison looked at her as if she were a child who had spoken out of turn. "My dear girl, you wouldn't understand the complexities of medical science. These are matters for trained professionals, not for people like you." Jacob felt anger surge through him. "People like her? What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean no offense, Dr. Forey," Morrison said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But we must be realistic about the limitations of education and breeding. This woman may mean well, but she simply doesn't have the background to understand proper medical care." "She's kept my mother alive and comfortable for months," Jacob said, his voice rising. "She's done more good than any doctor I've ever met." "Temporary comfort is not the same as proper treatment," Dr. Morrison replied. "I recommend immediate transfer to a proper medical facility. There's an excellent sanitarium in Denver that specializes in cases like this." Catherine's voice came from the bed, weak but determined. "I don't want to go to Denver. I want to stay here with my family." "Mrs. Hartwell," Dr. Morrison said, his tone becoming patronizing, "I understand your attachment to familiar surroundings, but we must think about what's best for your health." "What's best for my health is being surrounded by people who love me," Catherine replied, her voice growing stronger. "Elena has shown me more kindness and care than I ever expected. She's not just treating my body, she's healing my spirit." Dr. Morrison's face darkened. "Mrs. Hartwell, I must insist that you listen to medical reason rather than sentiment. This woman," he gestured at Elena, "is not qualified to make decisions about your care." "Then what about me?" Jacob asked. "Am I qualified to make decisions about my own mother?" "You're her son, yes, but you're also clearly influenced by your feelings for this woman. You're not thinking clearly about what's best for your mother." Elena had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now she spoke up. "Dr. Morrison, what would you recommend for Mrs. Hartwell's care?" "Complete rest, proper nutrition, and medications that can only be obtained through qualified medical channels, not herbs and folk remedies." "And if she doesn't want to leave her home?" Dr. Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Then she'll likely die." And it will be partly due to inadequate care from unqualified personnel. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Catherine gasped. Elena flinched, and Jacob felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Get out," Jacob said, his voice deadly quiet. "I beg your pardon?" "Get out of my house," Jacob repeated, his voice growing stronger. "Get out now." "Dr." Morrison drew himself up to his full height. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm trying to help your family. Don't let pride and attachment cloud your judgment." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Jacob said, moving toward the door. "Elena has done more for my mother than you have in 5 minutes. She's treated her with respect and kindness, and she's helped her feel human again. That's worth more than all your medical degrees." "You're making a serious mistake," Dr. Morrison warned as he gathered his things. "When your mother's condition worsens, remember that you chose sentiment over science." After he left, the cabin felt heavy with doubt and fear. Catherine had tears in her eyes. Elena looked shaken, and Jacob felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. "What if he's right?" Elena whispered. "What if I'm doing more harm than good?" "Don't listen to him," Catherine said firmly. "That man sees sickness, not people. You see me, Elena. You see who I am, not just what's wrong with me." But Jacob could see that Dr. Morrison's words had planted seeds of doubt in Elena's mind. Over the next few days, she second-guessed every decision, questioned every treatment, and seemed to lose confidence in her own abilities. "Maybe I should stop," she told Jacob one evening as they sat on the porch. "Maybe I should let someone else take care of your mother." "Someone else like who?" Jacob asked. "Dr. Morrison? He'd put her in an institution and forget about her. But what if he's right about the medical training? What if I'm missing something important?" Jacob took her hands, feeling how cold they were. "Elena, look at me. Do you remember what my mother was like before you came?" Elena nodded. She was dying, not just from the sickness, but from loneliness and fear. She had given up hope. But you changed that. You gave her reasons to keep fighting, reasons to smile, reasons to believe that her life still had meaning. "That's not medicine," Elena said quietly. "Isn't it?" Jacob asked. "What good is keeping someone's body alive if their spirit is dead? You've been treating the whole person, not just the disease. That's something Dr. Morrison will never understand." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I just don't want to fail her. I don't want to fail you." "You haven't failed anyone," Jacob said firmly. "You've saved us all." That night, Elena sat by Catherine's bedside, watching the older woman sleep peacefully. Catherine's breathing was steady, her color was good, and there was a peacefulness about her that hadn't been there before Elena's arrival. "She's right, you know," Catherine said softly, her eyes still closed. "That young man of yours. You have saved us all." Elena smiled, some of her confidence returning. "How are you feeling?" "Really feeling?" "Better than I have in months," Catherine replied, opening her eyes. "Not because the sickness is gone, but because I remember what it feels like to be cared for, to be valued. That's medicine too, Elena. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The next morning brought unexpected validation. Mrs. Henderson arrived with news that old Mr. Peterson, who had been treated by the town doctor for the same condition as Catherine, had died during the night. Dr. Morrison was treating him, Mrs. Henderson said quietly, following all the proper procedures, using all the right medicines, but Mr. Peterson just faded away. No fight left in him. Jacob and Elena exchanged glances. They both knew that Catherine's condition was just as serious as Mr. Peterson's had been. But she was still fighting, still finding reasons to smile. "Elena," Catherine said that afternoon, "I want you to teach me some of your grandmother's remedies. Not just for myself, but so I can help other people when I'm feeling stronger." Elena's eyes lit up. "You want to learn? I want to learn everything you can teach me. About healing, about caring for people, about seeing the person inside the sickness." As Elena began to share her knowledge, Jacob watched from the doorway and felt something settle in his chest. Dr. Morrison had tried to plant doubts, but he had actually strengthened their resolve. They were creating something new here, a way of caring for people that honored both body and spirit. "You know," Catherine said as Elena showed her how to prepare a particular tea, "I think this is what your grandmother would have wanted." Her knowledge passed down, helping people, growing stronger with each generation. Elena smiled, her confidence fully restored. I think you're right, and I think she would have liked you very much. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of coming spring. Inside the cabin, three people who had found each other against all odds continued building something beautiful. A family bound not by blood alone, but by love, respect, and the shared commitment to care for one another. Dr. Morrison had challenged them, but in doing so, he had helped them discover something important, that healing was about more than just medicine. It was about hope, dignity, and the power of human connection. And in that, Elena was the finest doctor any of them had ever known. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like the end of the world, carried by a grim-faced messenger who wouldn't meet Jacob's eyes as he handed over the official document. Elena's hands shook as she read the words that would change everything. By order of the Territorial Court, Elena Martinez Hartwell is commanded to appear for questioning regarding her legal status and marriage validity. They can't do this, Jacob said, his voice raw with disbelief as he read over Elena's shoulder. We're legally married. Dr. Brennan performed the ceremony. Elena's face had gone pale as winter snow. It's Ricardo. He's found a way to challenge our marriage. Look at this part. They're questioning whether I had the legal right to marry without my father's permission. Catherine struggled to sit up in her bed, her eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to give her strength. That's ridiculous. You're a grown woman, not a child. Not according to the laws Ricardo is using, Elena said, her voice hollow. In New Mexico territory, unmarried daughters are considered under their father's authority until they marry with his consent. Jacob felt the world tilting beneath his feet. But we're in Wyoming territory. Different laws apply here. The letter says they're investigating whether my presence here constitutes fleeing a legal obligation. Elena continued reading. If they decide our marriage isn't valid, I could be forced to return to New Mexico. The hearing was scheduled for the following week in Cheyenne, and Elena spent the days leading up to it in a state of quiet terror. She tried to continue caring for Catherine as if nothing had changed, but Jacob could see the fear eating away at her confidence. What if they decide against us? She asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Then we'll fight it, Jacob said firmly. We'll find a way. With what money? With what lawyer? Ricardo has resources we can't match. Jacob took her hand, feeling how cold her fingers were, despite the warm evening. We have something he doesn't have. We have the truth. The morning of the hearing, Jacob helped Elena dress in her best clothes, the simple blue dress she had worn to their wedding, carefully mended and pressed. She looked beautiful but fragile, like a bird preparing to fly into a storm. Whatever happens, Jacob said as they prepared to leave for town, remember that you're my wife, not because a court says so, but because we chose each other. Catherine, who had insisted on coming despite her weakness, sat wrapped in blankets on the wagon seat. That man thinks he can buy justice, she said, her voice fierce with determination. But some things can't be bought. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed with curious onlookers, drawn by the unusual case of a Mexican woman challenging a wealthy man's claim. Jacob felt their stares like physical weight as he walked Elena to the defendant's table. Ricardo sat across the aisle with his expensive lawyer, his face showing supreme confidence. He caught Elena's eye and smiled coldly, as if the outcome was already decided. Judge Harrison, a stern man with graying hair and sharp eyes, called the court to order. This is a hearing to determine the validity of a marriage between Elena Martinez and Jacob Hartwell, and to address claims that the defendant fled legal obligations in New Mexico territory. Ricardo's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Peterson, presented his case with practiced ease. Your Honor, my client has a valid marriage contract signed by Elena Martinez's father, making her legally promised to Mr. Vasquez. Her flight to Wyoming and subsequent marriage constitute breach of contract and potentially criminal abandonment. Objection, said Mr. Wells, the lawyer Jacob had managed to hire with his cattle money. Wyoming territory recognizes no such contracts binding adult women against their will. But the question remains, Peterson continued, whether Miss Martinez had the legal right to enter into marriage without her father's consent, particularly given her existing obligations. The testimony that followed was like a nightmare. Witnesses testified about Elena's sudden departure from New Mexico, the distress it caused her family, and Ricardo's legal right to recover his promised bride. Then Elena was called to testify. Jacob watched her walk to the witness stand, her head high despite the fear he knew she was feeling. "Miss Martinez," Peterson began, "did you enter into a marriage contract with my client?" "I did not," Elena said clearly. "My father signed a document without my knowledge or consent." "But you were aware of the arrangement?" "I was told about it the day before the wedding. I was not consulted about my wishes." Peterson's voice turned mocking. "And your wishes were more important than your family's honor, your father's word, and my client's legal rights?" Elena's voice grew stronger. "My wishes were about my own life, my own future. I believe I have the right to choose who I marry, even if that choice breaks legal agreements and causes financial harm to others?" "Yes," Elena said simply, "because I am a person, not property to be traded." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some approving, others shocked by her boldness. Jacob was called next, and he spoke about their relationship, their marriage, and Elena's care for his mother. His words were simple but heartfelt, and several people in the courtroom seemed moved by his obvious love for his wife. Then Catherine was helped to the witness stand, her frail body supported by Jacob's arm. Peterson objected to her testimony, claiming she was too ill to be reliable, but Judge Harrison allowed her to speak. "I am dying," Catherine said, her voice weak but clear. "In my final months, Elena has shown me more kindness than I ever expected. She has treated me not as a burden, but as a person worthy of care and respect. If you send her away, you will be destroying not just her happiness, but the life of someone who brings healing wherever she goes." Peterson tried to discredit Catherine's testimony, but her dignity and obvious sincerity made his attacks seem cruel. The final witness was Dr. Brennan, who testified about performing the marriage ceremony and his belief that Elena had freely chosen to marry Jacob. "In my opinion," Dr. Brennan said, "Elena Martinez is a woman of strong character who made a difficult but necessary choice to escape an unwanted marriage. Her subsequent marriage to Jacob Hartwell was entered into freely and with full understanding of the commitment involved." When the testimony ended, Judge Harrison called a recess to consider his decision. Jacob, Elena, and Catherine waited in the small room behind the courtroom, holding hands and praying for justice. "Whatever happens," Elena said quietly, "I want you to know that these have been the happiest months of my life. You've both given me something I never had before, the feeling of being valued for who I am." "Don't talk like it's over," Jacob said fiercely. "We're not giving up." When court resumed, Judge Harrison's expression was grave. This case presents a conflict between different legal traditions and different views of women's rights. However, this court operates under Wyoming territory law, which recognizes the right of adult women to enter into marriage contracts of their own free will. Jacob felt his heart stop. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "while Mr. Vasquez may have suffered disappointment, there is no evidence that Miss Martinez entered into any binding agreement. The contract was signed by her father without her knowledge or consent, making it invalid in this jurisdiction." Elena's hand tightened on Jacob's. "Therefore, this court finds that the marriage between Elena Martinez and Jacob Hartwell is valid under Wyoming territory law. Mrs. Hartwell is free to remain with her husband, and no legal obligation exists for her to return to New Mexico." The courtroom erupted in cheers and boos. Elena collapsed into Jacob's arms, sobbing with relief, while Catherine smiled through her tears. Ricardo stormed out of the courtroom, his face black with rage, but Jacob barely noticed. Elena was his wife, legally and completely, and no one could take her away from him. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Elena squeezed Jacob's hand. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "We did it together," Jacob replied, and realized that somewhere in the process of fighting for their love, he had found his voice again. The first snow of winter was falling like a blessing on the Wyoming prairie, covering the Hartwell cabin in a blanket of white that made the whole world look clean and new. Inside, Elena sat beside Catherine's bed, both women working on a quilt that would soon welcome a new member of their family. "I can't believe it," Catherine said, her voice filled with wonder as she watched Elena's hands rest protectively on her rounded belly. "A grandchild. I never thought I'd live to see this day." Elena smiled, her face glowing with happiness despite her fatigue. "The baby will know its grandmother, I'll make sure of that. Jacob entered the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and carrying fresh wood for the fire. His face lit up when he saw the two women working together, their voices soft with contentment. "How are you feeling?" he asked Elena, kneeling beside her chair to press his hand against her belly. "Happy," Elena said simply. "Tired, but happy." The baby moved under Jacob's palm, and his eyes widened with wonder. "Does it hurt when it moves like that?" "Not hurt," Elena said, laughing softly. "It feels like hope moving around inside me." Catherine set down her needle and looked at the young couple with tears in her eyes. "I need to tell you both something. Dr. Brennan was here yesterday while you were in town." Jacob's smile faded. "What did he say?" "He said I probably won't live to see spring," Catherine said calmly. "The sickness is spreading faster now." Elena's hand flew to her mouth. "No, you're getting better. You have to get better." "I have gotten better," Catherine said gently. "Not in my body, but in my spirit. These past months with you have been the best of my life. I've watched my son fall in love. I've gained a daughter, and now I know there will be a grandchild to carry on our family. That's more than I ever dared hope for." Jacob felt tears burning his eyes. "Mama, don't talk like that. You're going to get well." "Jacob," Catherine said, her voice firm but loving, "I need you to listen to me. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready. But I need to know that you and Elena will be all right without me." "We'll never be all right without you," Elena said, her voice breaking. "You're the heart of this family." "No," Catherine said, reaching out to take Elena's hand. "You are. You brought love back into this house, gave my son a reason to speak again, and now you're carrying the future in your body. I'm not the heart of this family. I'm just the one who got to see it being born." Over the following weeks, Catherine's condition worsened rapidly. Elena cared for her with fierce devotion, barely leaving her bedside except when Jacob insisted she rest. The approaching birth made it difficult for Elena to move around, but she refused to let anyone else take over Catherine's care. "She took care of me when I was afraid and alone," Elena told Jacob when he suggested getting help from town. "Now it's my turn to take care of her." One evening in late February, as a fierce wind howled around the cabin, Catherine called both Jacob and Elena to her bedside. "I want to give you something," she said, reaching under her pillow to pull out a small wooden box. "This was my mother's, and her mother's before that. It's not worth much in money, but it's worth everything in love." Elena opened the box to find a simple gold locket, worn smooth by generations of hands. Inside was a tiny painting of a woman who looked remarkably like Catherine. "She looks like you," Elena whispered. "And someday your daughter will look like you," Catherine said. That's how love continues, from one generation to the next. Elena fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of history and hope against her skin. "I'll treasure it always. And I want you to have this," Catherine said, turning to Jacob and pressing something into his palm. It was his father's wedding ring, simple and strong. "Mama, I already have a wedding ring," Jacob said. "That's for your son," Catherine said. "When he's old enough to understand what love means, I want him to have something from his grandfather." Jacob's throat was too tight to speak, but he nodded, understanding. 3 days later, on a morning when the sun shone so brightly it made the snow sparkle like diamonds, Catherine passed peacefully in her sleep. Elena held one of her hands, Jacob held the other, and she died surrounded by the love she had waited her whole life to see. The funeral was small, but meaningful. Dr. Brennan spoke about Catherine's kindness and strength. Mrs. Henderson shared memories of her generosity, and Jacob found the words to thank his mother for giving him life twice, once when she bore him, and again when she welcomed Elena into their family. "She taught me that love isn't something you wait for," Jacob said, his voice steady despite his tears. "It's something you choose, something you build, something you fight for. She fought for our happiness until her last breath, and that's a lesson I'll never forget." Elena stood beside him, her hand in his, her other hand resting on her belly where their child grew. She had learned from Catherine that family wasn't just about blood. It was about choosing to love someone completely, accepting them as they were, and helping them become who they were meant to be. As they walked home from the cemetery, Elena felt the baby move strongly, as if it knew that its grandmother's spirit would always be with them. The cabin felt different without Catherine's presence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, full of love, and full of hope for the future. She was right, Elena said, as they sat by the fire that evening. Love does continue from one generation to the next. Our baby will know about its grandmother, about the woman who brought us together and taught us what family really means. Jacob pulled Elena close, feeling her warmth against his side and the gentle movement of their child between them. And our child will know that love is worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth everything. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the grass, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared to welcome new life into the world, carrying with them the love and wisdom of the woman who had made their happiness possible. The silent heart of Wyoming had learned to sing at last, and its song would echo through generations yet to come.